Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Executive Director of Hyperledger, Brian Behlendorf.
We're back on the train.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the very first Hyperledger Global Forum. Woo! Yes. I've been telling everyone this is the first blockchain conference you'll ever go to where you won't get an ICO pitch. We won't care too much about the price of different cryptocurrencies. We won't care too much about a lot of the hype and a lot of the, well, despite hype being the first four letters of Hyperledger. What you'll hear for the next couple of days across the different sessions here, across tutorials on Friday and Saturday, or at the hackathon on Saturday and Sunday, if you want to come along for that, is really kind of where we are as a community, where we are as a family of technologies, where we are as an industry to some degree. But we also hopefully get to really meet the people behind these technologies and the people behind the companies putting this all together. Because kind of like Soil and Green, we're made of people, these industries, the blockchain space. And that's why we come together at a face-to-face gathering like this. So we're really excited to make this happen. I do want to kind of just start with a few notes. This event, like all Linux Foundation events, operates with a pretty strong code of conduct policy. That's something that you'll see repeated a number of times. We just want to make sure everyone feels comfortable, everyone understands kind of what this means as a conference and coming together is to create a space where all of us feel welcome, all of us feel included. And so I really appreciate the fact you can pay that your attention paid to that. Also, I really want to thank our sponsors. Let me see. Particularly Accenture, who came in as a diamond sponsor. Thank you very much. But really, all of the sponsors who've been here, not just to throw their name and logo up on a page like this, but also have a presence in our sponsors gallery, and to also, of course, be really strong in supporting members of the community and the technologies that we put together. So we have a great series of keynotes for you this morning, covering a lot of different domains, a lot of that having to do with kind of where we are as an industry, where we're deploying these technologies, where we're getting them into production, but also a little bit about kind of technologically speaking, what are some directions that we could head in or should head in, and looking a little bit at how these technologies can get applied to solve societal scale kinds of challenges. So with that, I thought I'd welcome you all and kind of dive in and kind of give my sense, my overview, my state of the ledger, so to speak, on where we are, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much. So I'm so glad that this is finally a talk that I can start where I don't have to explain what a blockchain is. I have like a standard deck like everybody does that starts with all sorts of moving parts. But here, you all know that. That's why you're here. But what we really still love to emphasize is the fact that Hyperledger as a community is part of the Linux Foundation, right? That we are a community embedded inside what is probably the largest open source juggernaut out there as an organization kind of continuing to help professionalize, help grow the commercial ecosystem around open source code. Not just the Linux operating system, which is where a lot of this all got started, but now in related technology fields like cloud computing, software-defined networking, automotive, telecom, all of this with the same broad template, right? Define kind of a problem space, an interesting technological challenge, and organize both the developer community around solving that and shipping code that enterprises can trust, as well as the commercial community behind that, right? And help make that a sustainable kind of two-way street. So not only is a lot of good open source code getting created and delivered and being put into products and services, but that those organizations feed back and it becomes a virtuous cycle. And so that's really the Linux Foundation's MO, and that's Hyperledger's MO, and all of you are a part of that. And within Hyperledger, I mean, this is an amazing chart. I should mention, by the way, that in 1 week will be the third birthday of the Hyperledger project. It was December 17th, 2015, when the press release was sent out. I guess we call press releases the birth of things these days. But when the press release was sent out announcing that a set of organizations, about 30 at the time, were coming together to form this thing called Hyperledger. And I remember seeing that and had been doing my own kind of research into the blockchain space and going, okay, this makes a lot more sense to me than a lot of what else I saw. So in 3 years, we've grown in a lot of different ways. All of you perhaps have seen this slide, and we've got copies of it elsewhere. Perhaps we're overly proud of this, but what we really are doing here is building a family of related technologies, a portfolio, if you think of it that way, of different points in the solution landscape to try to go and build distributed ledger and smart contract technology. And some of these I'm sure you are very familiar with. Projects like Fabric and Sawtooth are now in production, both as software projects, but also now deployed in production scenarios. Lots of people building their own blockchain systems. We'll talk about that all week long. Some of them are still very young. I'll mention Hyperledger Ursa, which we don't even have a logo for yet, but we're getting there. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, as well as lots of other pieces that really help us map this landscape, whether it's Iroha, which is very focused on mobile and payments, or Indy, which is very focused on digital identity, particularly in this kind of distributed, self-sovereign identity kind of space, or tools like Caliper, which are designed to measure the performance of different blockchain platforms, which, by the way, is not only useful for Fabric and Sawtooth, but has now been adapted to measure, I believe, quorum, and is Corda supported on Caliper? I forget. But the goal is to try to have this be a tool for comparing like for like, apples to apples, across a lot of the major blockchain platforms. So really proud of this slide. This is really the heart of who we are as a community. We ship code, and if we didn't do this, nothing else would matter. But to give a bit more stats, in those 3 years since we launched, stats in open source projects are really kind of hard to pin your finger on anyways. So the things that we can measure are things like how many developers have been involved in the project, have actually contributed code or other form of IP. And there, across those 11 different projects, we've had 790 different developers contributing code, which is a pretty amazing number. I mean, a lot of open source projects, even if they have lots and lots of users, an example I'll give is OpenSSL, which was used in every single SSL and TLS implementation out there, and was being maintained at one point by 2 guys named Steve. That's since been fixed, but often open source projects come from very few participants. There's a very steep kind of a power curve there, and with Hyperledger, we've really invested a lot in bringing more developers, not only to be users of the technology, but up the kind of contributor curve to becoming core contributors. And you'll see a lot more from us on that this year. If you want to measure lines of code, 11 million lines of code across the different Hyperledger projects, 65,000 different pull requests, different commits. And then in terms of the size of the community, we've grown quite a bit. We have over 260 different members in Hyperledger. These are the sponsoring organizations that help all of us get out of bed and show up for work and kind of help make this whole kind of a project happen. We've got 9 different working groups and special interest groups that are organized to try to kind of cut across the different projects and think about their application in fields like healthcare or the government sector or other spaces like that, as well as a very broad meetup community. I'm sure many of you have been to the meetups worldwide and have seen kind of the local communities that we're hoping to build in all these spaces, including in China, where we've had 30 different cities host a Hyperledger meetup, which is pretty awesome. And then the edX course. I probably am more famous now as a face, not that I have a great face, but I'm more famous now thanks to that edX course than anything else that I've done. I get more people pop up and say, yeah, you're the one in that video, right? So that's awesome. But 140,000 people have started taking that course, and you'll see a lot more that we're doing on the training and education side pretty soon. Of course, we're continuing to grow. These are new organizations that have come in as supporting members of the Hyperledger community. I want to shout out particularly to Deutsche Telekom, who you'll be hearing more from today, to Alibaba Cloud, who are also here, I believe, to organizations kind of around the world. Hana Bank is a big bank in South Korea. Just a lot of great organizations. WeTrade you'll hear from today or tomorrow as well. So continuing to grow, continuing to go into a lot of new industries as well. In fact, right after me, we'll be hearing a lot about healthcare, of all things. And also today, you can find Fabric hosted as a cloud service across all of the major cloud service providers out there as a series of templates, or in some cases, even more deeply in kind of a real more managed, kind of almost Heroku-style cloud service. And that's obviously AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, but also the major clouds in China, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, and Huawei, and obviously IBM, Oracle, SAP, and then a lot of emerging kind of cloud providers as well. Blockdaemon, I should mention, as well as perhaps some of you out there also specializing in running this stuff really well, really professionally. That's so essential to getting greater adoption of these technologies. But now let's talk about production deployments. And maybe I'm oversensitive about the article that appeared in the Reg a few weeks ago, talking about how precisely 0.0% of blockchain technologies are being used in production, because no one returned the reporter's phone call when he asked if people are using it. They didn't call us, nor did they call any of the people that I think we're going to be pointing you to, because 3 years in, this R&D project that explored this kind of interesting new kind of, is it a database, is it a network, that kind of thing, is now being used in real production systems. And I'm going to go too quickly for a lot of these, because a lot of these projects represent, a huge investment of time and effort to get up and run and really have substance all their own. So apologies if I go through these too quickly, but we're getting all of these up on the site as much as we can, and all of them have issued their own releases and other things. So definitely encourage you to look more into this. The first one I want to mention, since we're here in Switzerland, is Swisscom, who will also be, I believe, presenting later today along with Swiss Post, who, like the other cloud providers, are providing a Swiss-based infrastructure for hosting of Fabric instances and building blockchain systems. One of the first customers they're talking about launching, or one of the first projects they've launched, is a equities trade platform on a Swiss share registry on a blockchain system called Dara. And this is the first one in Switzerland. Switzerland has a number of other stock exchanges like the SIX and others. This is the first one running here in a regulated environment. This is running on Hyperledger Fabric, and is all about using this platform as a way to replace essentially the way that stocks are traded out there otherwise, right? To get away from the centralization that typical marketplaces have to see. So that's really awesome, and we'll hear more from Swisscom this week. On the other side of the planet, down in Singapore, there's a startup company that's been a part of Hyperledger for a little while now called DLT Ledgers, and they've been working with DBS Bank, one of the largest banks in Singapore, and AgriCorp, which is one of the largest agricultural organizations, predominantly representing Australian farmers. And they've built a trade finance network that has been deployed now for a couple of months. Actually, when we did put this presentation slide together, it was about a month ago, where they had been in production for 2 months. And this is all about financing the supply chain process, trade finance, right? Issuing of letters of credit to farmers to be able to sell their goods in other countries. So over that time frame, those 2 months, they conducted 2,500 trades. Doesn't sound like a big deal. We ask about, can we do 2,500 transactions a second on a platform like this? So 2,500 2 months, what's the big deal there? Well, each of those trades represents about $300,000 worth of business, represents actually hundreds of different data points that get registered into a blockchain, into the platform. And so total over those 2 months, they've seen $750 million of business conducted just over that network, right? Involving 4,500 different farmers in that network, 124 trading organizations, some really impressive numbers there. And that's cool. That's like real production use. I'm so happy for them. In another part of the world, in Rwanda, there's a group here you'll hear more about, I believe, over the next few days, from a company called Circular that has worked with the government of Rwanda and the Congo to try to build a platform for traceability of tantalum. Tantalum is one of these heavy metals, these kind of precious metals that are used inside of batteries, inside of a lot of electronics, for which there's actually some very dark places where that comes from, and places that are not regulated, places that involve slave labor and other really horrible practices. There is a certification process for for tantalum mines, like there are for a lot of goods. And this platform is being used to try to provide traceability at the package level of product coming out of approved mines, approved facilities that are inspected, that sort of thing. And to try to make sure that when consumers in the EU is kind of where it's focused in the OECD countries, that it's certified to those standards. So this is great, and this is exactly the kind of use case that we see all over in the diamond space, but also in the grocery space, in food and rice and that sort of thing, where this traceability is essential. And the traceability, I mean, in all these examples, you should be asking why blockchain, why distributed ledger? And it's because there isn't a single party everyone wants to anoint and trust to hold the keys to the central database tracking the flow of these goods. The only way to get to a level of trustability in these kinds of far-flung networks with lots of different participants is through blockchain technology, and Fabric happens to be excellent for that. Lots of other examples I can walk you through. I don't want to take too much time, but there's an organization that's now working in the airline industry to use Fabric to try to manage the process of booking tickets and moving records between different airlines and aeronautics organizations. You've all heard of the IBM Food Trust Network, which is very much this traceability, particularly for the threat of transmitted diseases. If anyone is familiar with the E. coli that was discovered in lettuce coming from California a couple of weeks back, well, the only way without blockchain technology to address that and keep more people from getting sick is to ban all leafy goods from an entire state or in the entire supply chain. Once this is more widely rolled out, and next year Walmart has actually mandated that all of their suppliers, their T1 suppliers, get onto the network that they've built here, that at that point they'll be able to pinpoint exactly which processing facility, maybe even which farm that tainted product might have come from. So that's pretty cool to see. Monetico, Jesse Chenard, I'm sure, is wandering around. I think he might even be talking at some point. But Monetico has built India's first financial network using blockchain technology. This solution helps enables participants to find information about reducing fraud around receivables and receivables financing. That's really cool. And then in China, we've talked a bit about kind of how international this project is. In China, where there is a deployment by a set of banks many of you perhaps have not heard of, but are rather big there, like CITIC Bank, China Minsheng Bank, the People's Bank of China. And they set this up as a letter of credit system, another part of the trade finance kind of world, where on their first day of business, these trades facilitated over 100 million renminbi, which is about $16 million US of letters of credit. Now it's doing over 1 billion renminbi a day on that platform. So like real business, real deployments, right? WeTrade, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. We'll hear from Robert Manzioni, who's heading that project. He'll be talking later, tomorrow, I believe. And more that we can go into. One's in the insurance space. JD.com, which is one of the largest retailers in China, also has a supply chain project. Too many to really mention. In fact, companies, many of you who are here today have been involved in some of these projects. Some you've heard of, like Maersk or Everledger. We'll hear from Leanne Kemp tomorrow about how they're deploying this in the diamond space. But a lot of really awesome projects out there, too many to, in fact, get to. In fact, what we've realized, or what I think a lot of people are realizing is we kind of need for this space what you have with the cryptocurrency space, which is kind of a coin market cap, right? A way to kind of compare dollar for dollar, transaction for transaction, you know, who is involved in these technologies or these networks? Are they running? Are they alive? Can we go find them? There's a start to this, which is something set up by Jonathan Levy and his developers at Hasera, who have also been very close to Hyperledger for its 3 years of operation. Tracking deployments of blockchain platforms out there. They're not going to cover everything. It's kind of self-reported and depends upon people, to be honest. But right now, it's tracking 87 different Fabric deployments out there. And these are networks. networks. These are multi-party networks that are, alive and buzzing. Some of them might be late-stage POCs or pilots, right? And again, we're kind of taking people's word for it. But this is really awesome, and it shows kind of as close as we can get to a numeric comparison of market share, if you want to consider it that, or mind share, that sort of thing. It's really great to see us and the other projects out there kind of getting traction out there and getting deployed. And in our own community, we know that we have 88 different companies in our vendor directory. These are companies providing products and services on Hyperledger now, many of you out there. 5 different training partners now, so you can get a lot of training from a number of different organizations based on geography, based on kind of how deep they go, that sort of thing. And then 45 different entries in our blockchain showcase, where it's us trying to show off where people are using this. We always need more, though. We need more examples. We need more of you to tell us what you're doing with this code. Trumpet your own horn, your own kind of successes, but also feel free to tell us where things aren't working as well, because that's how we grow, is learning more. On the developer side, you're going to hear a lot more tomorrow from Dan Middleton, who'll be giving a keynote. Dan is the head of the technical steering committee, and I think we'll give you more of a flavor of technically what has this community accomplished. But we've done some really hard things this year. We've gotten the Ethereum VM not only brought in as Hyperledger Burrow, as many of you know, but now also deployed onto Sawtooth and on top of Fabric as first-class business logic engines, basically. Iroha, Indy, and Composer are all moving closer to a 1.0 release. Composer might get a reboot. Lots more to talk about here on that front. But lots of users out there for a platform that has been kind of an on-ramp to using Fabric and other related technologies. Lots and lots of white papers from our different working groups have been delivered on architecture, on consensus mechanisms, on identities coming up soon, and lots of activity in Asia and Hackfests in Montreal and Amsterdam and at UCLA earlier this year. And I mentioned Hyperledger Ursa. This is one of the things that gets me really excited because with Ursa, what we've done is pulled together people working on different projects to say, let's refactor, let's abstract out all of the cryptography routines that people are using into a common library that can be independently vetted, that can be independently certified if there are different certifications out there, FIPS 140, those sorts of things. But to help actually reduce the risk of somebody inadvertently using these tools the wrong way, which is very easy to do. This is the kind of code that everyone really depends on being accurate and timely. So let's make sure this works really well. So Ursa has been pulled out, and what's great as well is we see involvement on these projects from developers even working on some public ledger technologies like Dfinity. They've been active in the project as well. So I think this is actually an example of code that could be used well beyond Hyperledger's own uses for cryptography routines. And then a recent supply chain project we still have to find a cute name for. Naming in open source is harder than anyone wants to admit, but it really speaks to where we could go from this point forward. Now that we've got these kind of frameworks and tools, maybe we go into libraries, maybe we even start to touch end-user applications, things that help us understand, are we really using all these things the right way? We had a great internship program this year, 10 different interns, some of whom are here. You'll be able to meet them later today, 3 p.m. down on the second floor foyer, hear about their projects and what they've worked on. And really importantly, we need mentors for 2019. I've also been traveling quite a bit. Some of you might have seen me in far-flung locations. This is me in Iceland, talking about, yes, wearing the same shirt, talking about blockchain technology to penguins and icebergs. This is while I was visiting Santiago, Chile in January, shortly after which I sat on stage and gave Joe Lubin side-eye at Davos. Joe's great. We've been on stage a number of times together, and as many of you know, we are figuring out ways for Hyperledger and Ethereum to work more closely together so that great ideas and technology coming from that domain are things that we can deploy very quickly. But really, this is a worldwide phenomenon. We've got 150 of these different kind of meetup communities in all parts of the world, and that's growing. Many of you are here, I think, from those different meetup communities, and that's essential to being able to scale all this. We also had hosted a great member summit a few months ago in Montreal, which is really a chance for us internally to figure out, are we building the right kinds of things, to be really honest with ourselves, because how many other blockchain projects really challenge their own assumptions on a daily basis, challenge their own rationales? That's the source of our strength here. That's the source of our integrity, I think, is our interest in looking at this very objectively and going, are we building the right kinds of things? And as part of the where we go over 2019, you're going to see a lot more kind of professionalization, I think, of this space. Now that things are moving into production, we need to think about what does it really mean to take this in a production-oriented direction. So one of the big things there is certifications for developers and administrators of these platforms. Basically, to answer the question that anybody might pose, if we want to put this into production, how do we guarantee that this really isn't that this isn't going to fall over, right? How do we know it's going to scale? We'll have high uptime, that sort of thing. So we just launched, I think last night, the official release of the Sawtooth Administrator Certification. So that's available now. You can sign up and start taking that course, and at the end of it, you'll have something you can put on your LinkedIn page that says, hey, I know how to admin these things. The one for Fabric is still under development. You can sign up for the beta that should start at the end of this year, and we'll get that launched pretty soon as well. Now, it being Christmas time, I thought I would try to give you a little bit of my wish list for 2019. No time to go into depth on any of these things. It does not have to do with holding a Bitcoin or anything. It's just when you do a Google search at 1 in the morning on blockchain and Santa, this is about the best that comes up, so I thought you'd all appreciate it. But here's where I think my take on where this community goes, and we really could use all of your help in going this direction. In addition to certifying developers, we're going to get into certifying cloud providers, basically to help make sure that when organizations are providing Fabric or Sawtooth or Indy or these other frameworks, that it's easy to add nodes on other networks. Because that's kind of the whole point of deploying these systems, is to get that decentralization going. Likewise, we'll look at what other communities have done around certifying solution providers in this space, so that there's a really great answer to the question of who do I hire to help me build my blockchain applications to help build on top of Hyperledger technologies. We know we need better community metrics to figure out as a community, are we really growing in the way that we want to? Are we really helping people up that contributor curve to becoming a maintainer and getting more maintainers in? And we know we need to reach beyond the blockchain world to developer communities all over the map. There are other open source projects out there that are trying to solve kind of higher level problems. If we can come in and say, if you use Hyperledger underneath, you solve this in a unique way, that'd be pretty cool. I think, in fact, a hallmark of our success would be being able to point to other projects on GitHub that have dependencies on different Hyperledger code. More dogfooding, using the tools ourselves to solve some real problems. There's a couple of things in Hyperledger Labs. I would point out something called the Software Parts Archive that is trying to build a high-integrity database of signatures of software to use to help verify builds and that sort of thing. More production networks, obviously, like that whole list. Like, if we can just get closer and closer to helping people conclusively answer that question, who's using this in production and what's the value that they're getting, that'll make all of our jobs easier when we go to actually get support for building and deploying these technologies. More componentization, like we see with Ursa, and hopefully we'll see with some other technologies inside of Hyperledger. And then finally, the world kind of misunderstands us, I think, a little bit when they think that, well, this is in opposition to some of the public ledger things, that this is, we've made fun of cryptocurrencies here a couple times, but that this is actually, there's a spectrum here. And we're solving different kinds of problems, going about them very differently, but that in the middle ground is where we start to see some really interesting things. What happens when these networks, these permission networks we're building, will grow to hundreds or thousands of nodes? Will we have to use consensus mechanisms and incentive mechanisms and crypto economic kinds of tools that we've been using, or that the public ledger communities are really experimenting and figuring out? So there's a lot to learn from here, and I think this community is uniquely poised to figure it out. And so getting all of your help to do that would be really awesome. That is probably an overwhelming amount of information. I totally apologize for dipping you in the deep end at 9 a.m. in the morning on a Wednesday. But these are the kinds of things I hope that we learn more about and talk more about and really challenge each other over here at the Hyperledger Global Forum this week.